In this episode, we're delving into a topic that sparks debate and opens avenues for understanding. It's moderation management and the increasingly popular movement known as Dry and Damp January. So join us as we break away from conventional norms and explore this nuanced approach. This is the Well Aware Podcast.
Hello and Happy New Year, and welcome back to the Well Aware Podcast. I'm really excited for today's session. Those of you that are following the Well Aware Podcast have seen that we've been profiling folks that have been able to go through the recovery process and ultimately become employees at Aware. We're going to switch it up a little bit and today we're going to attack head on and unravel some of the complexities that we all experience with regards to addiction recovery. We're going to use our very own addiction psychiatrist to challenge some of the conventional norms, and we're going to explore some of the innovative approaches that I think you'll really enjoy hearing in this particular episode. Today, I'm joined by a friend and colleague, Dr. Lauren Grauert. She happens to be the Chief Medical Officer of Aware Recovery Care. We did not know each other before she joined Aware. She joined us about 6 months ago, double-board addiction psychiatrist, very, very experienced and intelligent, but also an incredibly nice and warm human being. So I am really looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Dr. Grauert.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me, and Happy New Year. It's so good to be here.
I'm glad you're here. And heck, why don't we just kick it off and go right at it and challenge the conventional norms around addiction recovery? How does that sound to you?
Let's do it. This is a safe place. It's a non-judgmental zone, and I'm so happy to talk more about this topic. I do always encourage everyone to remember it's important to discuss your individual clinical situation with your provider directly, but we're really happy to talk about different approaches to addiction treatment.
That's great. And you will know better than I that there are a lot of controversial topics in this particular space. And there are folks that feel very strongly and firmly about their views on addiction recovery and the proper modalities associated with that. We're not here to disrupt or dispute those particular thoughts. We're here to discuss alternative ways of thinking for the purpose of having a balanced discussion. So let's kick it off with moderation management, which, as you know better than I, can be a controversial topics in this space. So why don't you explain what it is and sort of expound on how you think it differs from the traditional narrative centered around abstinence?
Absolutely. So moderation management is basically a fancy way of saying I'm going to reduce my substance or alcohol intake instead of stopping altogether. As you already said, and what I want to really emphasize is that abstinence is certainly the best, safest, and healthiest approach, period, full stop. And as a physician, I'm always going to tell folks that. That being said, we know that addiction is a really complex disease. And some of that involves the patient themselves having various degrees of thoughts on what they should do with alcohol or substances. And so moderation management is an approach where a patient says, hey, you know what? I want to reduce my alcohol intake. I don't want to stop all the way together. And you work in conjunction with your provider to find out, what does that look like? What do you want your goals to be? And how can I be successful in accomplishing a reduced substance consumption versus stopping altogether? Again, super important to emphasize that abstinence is best, but there's a really important place in the addiction treatment ecosystem for moderation management. So I think it's important for folks to know about it.
And I guess the believers in the traditional models would say it does not work. What do you think about moderation management, and can it work for select patients?
Yes, absolutely. So the answer is it can work depending on the individual patient. I think where folks are coming from when they say it doesn't work is that we know addiction is a disease. And what that means is it's hard to have a red light and a green light in the brain. A lot of times there's no red light. So some folks are skeptical, saying, you know what, this is not going to work because there's no red light. It's an all or nothing thing. And that can be true for many patients who struggle with addiction. That being said, we have other patients who they're just not ready to go there. You know, there's lots of reasons. Alcohol is really a fixture in our society, unfortunately, and it's a lot harder to avoid alcohol than other substances. And so some folks, for a variety of reasons, even though abstinence might be the best approach, say, I want to use a different tactic. And so for those folks, in order for moderation management to work, it's really important that they include their family members in that discussion, their friends in that discussion, their allies in that discussion, and of course, their treatment team in that discussion. And if you have an open, honest dialogue with all of those folks and saying, here's where my current consumption is now, here's where my relationship with substances is, and here's where I would like to be, it sets you up for success. And it also helps you practice the really, really critical skill of honesty, which is a skill that all of us can use and is even more important in the recovery space.
And I guess somehow, as we see sometimes in politics, in the addiction treatment space, folks that believe in abstinence are firmly wedded to that approach to addiction recovery. If I were to stick you in a room with somebody that would be a counterpart of yours that was equally passionate about abstinence, and it's not to say that you're not understanding and accepting of abstinence, you said as much. How would you have that discussion with someone that is firmly in belief that abstinence is the only way? And how do we address that stigma and sort of bridge the gap?
Yeah, I think first of all, I would agree with them that abstinence is the best way. Certainly, from a health perspective, you're going to get the most benefits from stopping alcohol altogether. And so I would wholeheartedly agree with that person and say, yes, this is the best way. That being said, as a physician, my goal is to help as many people as possible. And one way to do that in addiction treatment is to meet somebody where they're at. And so I might have somebody who comes into my office and says, I want to reduce my alcohol from 2 bottles of wine a day to 1 glass of wine a day. And as a physician, I know, you know what, that plan would be best if it was 2 bottles of wine a day to 0 a day. But if I say that to that person at that time, oftentimes what's going to happen is it's going to end the relationship. The patient's going to be saying, this person doesn't understand me. They don't get me. They don't have faith in me. See you later. So if I'm able to say, let's talk more about that. Let's get curious about your alcohol consumption. Let's work with your goal to begin with and see what that journey looks like. Then ultimately, I'm able to help more people to achieve their goals. And the other thing that happens is sometimes folks realize themselves, hey, this is not working for me. I've tried to go from 2 bottles of wine a day to 1 glass a day. I've been unsuccessful with that. And when folks are able to develop that insight on their own versus me telling them in the beginning or lecturing, it's a much more powerful indicator of success long term for them to say, gosh, you know what? They'll come back to me the next appointment. I tried to do that. It didn't work. Can you help me now? And so it's better to have the conversation in that order than it is for me to say, you know what? I don't believe in you. This is not going to work. It's not a great idea from the outset.
That's super interesting. I'll have listen to you talk that through. Why don't we switch to another topic and another term that is quite honestly new to me, and that's the dry and damp January term. How does this movement play into the broader landscape of addiction recovery, and how would you sort of catch that with what we've just been talking about with regards to moderation management and the abstinence approach to addiction recovery?
Yeah, I think with the new year, as humans, we always have a drive to improve ourselves. That's kind of innate in us. And the new year often marks a good time when people are introspective and they reflect, how can I become a better version of myself? And so that often displays itself in weight loss, that displays itself in exercise, relationship building, and of course, a natural consequence also looking at your relationship with alcohol or substances. So the concept of dry January is that I'm not going to drink any alcohol for all of January. A damp January is a moderation management approach where somebody says, you know what? I'm not feeling great drinking all of this alcohol. I don't want to go cold turkey. Let me find a way to do that in the middle. And you see this in healthcare and other places. Folks who start exercising, it's usually not an all or nothing approach. And in fact, we know in those segments as well, with exercise, with nutrition, that people are actually more likely to be successful in the long term with those changes when they do it on a timeline and a goal that is realistic for them. And so moderation management is the same concept. I'm going to make changes in my relationship to alcohol on a goal that's realistic for me, that's doable for me, and that'll really have some meaningful, positive consequences with your health.
How would you layer in medication therapy to this conversation we've been having with regards to moderation management? What is the role of medications, and how does it sort of intertwine with all of the various approaches we've been talking about in terms of abstinence versus moderation management and such?
Yeah, great question. There are several FDA approved medications out there that are FDA approved to reduce alcohol cravings or opioid cravings, and medications that will also make you even sick if you drink alcohol. Traditionally, folks have thought of those medications as something that can only be used and only effective if there is zero alcohol intake. What we're finding out, actually, more and more research is showing, is that some of these medications, one is called naltrexone, if you take it every day, will actually decrease alcohol craving, even if there is some alcohol present in somebody's life. And so here at Aware, we have specialists who help with these kinds of situations and can prescribe medications for clients that will help them be successful with reducing their alcohol intake without necessarily stopping. And the way these work is actually by decreasing endorphins that are released when people drink. And so medications are really a great option that can help with abstinence, but also with moderation management. And we love providing that service here at Aware. We're eager to provide that service. And there's also medications people can take, as I was saying before, that will make you sick if you drink. Traditionally, those medications have been looked at as an all or nothing approach, but those medications can be integrated in a moderation management way as well. I often have folks who will take those kind of medications before they go to a high risk environment. And it's a situation where maybe they don't want to drink at a wedding, they don't want to drink on a cruise, and they take those medications for limited periods of time where they know they're going to be more vulnerable. And then they stop taking those medications in their day-to-day life when they feel more confident with the ability to do reduced alcohol intake. So absolutely a key component that can really help folks be successful with moderation management and abstinence. And we provide that service here at Aware and are happy to help folks on that journey.
And I guess as we attack head on some of the different ways people approach the treatment paradigms, I think I've also heard from the abstinence camp that if someone's on medications for extended period of times, they're not truly in recovery. How would you approach that concept as medications being a sign of a weakness with regards to not truly in recovery versus something that's allowing an individual to feel empowered to continue on the recovery journey?
Yes. Yes, you do hear that a lot. And what I always remind folks of about addiction is that it is a complex physical disease that has manifestations in people's daily life. And so just like any other physical disease that I relate it to diabetes, for instance. If you have diabetes, some folks can be successful with just diet and exercise to reduce their sugar, but many folks need metformin. They need insulin. And that is purely a reflection of the disease process of diabetes. If I have high blood pressure, sometimes I can decrease that with exercise and dietary changes alone. Many times I'm going to need a blood pressure medication. And so I would relate the same thing to addiction and say, this is a physical disease with behavioral manifestations. And because there is a physical and a behavioral component, it can often be really important to have medications plus therapy and lifestyle changes. I'm a big proponent of saying skills over pills. At the end of the day, the recovery skills and the non-medication skills that you need to learn to be successful in recovery are the most important. Absolutely. That being said, there's a very important place for medication management for many folks to address the physical component of that disease. And if we ignore that, we're really doing folks a disservice.
That makes sense. Let me throw another term out there, harm reduction. And from a harm reduction perspective, how would you talk about moderation management and the safety considerations with regards to harm reduction?
Yeah, this is a really, really tricky one, and definitely controversial in our society. So harm reduction usually refers to a decreased amount of substances that are non-alcohol. Um, I want to be very clear as a physician and say to patients and anybody who's listening that no amount of an illicit substance is safe. And as a physician, I'm never going to recommend that a patient continue any amount of illicit substances. And in that category largely falls things like heroin, fentanyl, hallucinogenics. No amount of that illicit is safe. So that's the main message. That being said, we know that there are a subset of people who, no matter how much I or anybody else says that until we're blue in the face, is going to continue using that substance anyway. And oftentimes that person is not willing to stop altogether, but they're willing to consider cutting down. And so it's a very challenging path to walk as a provider, because you don't want to encourage any amount of substance use. But you also know that it's good for a patient to be engaged at some degree than for them to not be engaged at all. And so that's the concept behind harm reduction, is that you work with a patient where they're at, even if they're not willing to stop using an illicit substance, you work with them on how can I get to that point ultimately, and it might involve baby steps in between.
That makes sense. But maybe let's, as we sort of near the conclusion of this segment, switch to the risks of moderation management, in particular for those with severe addiction or specific substances that pose higher risks, and maybe even layering on those with medical comorbidities. We've talked a lot about where medication management would fit in. How do you sort of balance some of the risks associated with continuing to use versus abstinence in high-risk cases for the patients that you've seen over the course of your career?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, well, it depends on the substance, but from an opioid use disorder perspective, I am always, always encouraging both patients and family members to carry Narcan, naloxone. So that's the intranasal overdose prevention medication. It's over the counter. It's life-saving. Unfortunately, we know that fentanyl these days is more and more powerful. It has more and more dilutants into it. We're seeing carfentanil. And so having Narcan available becomes even more important, so that if somebody does have a recurrence and an unintentional overdose, you have Narcan available. I often have patients and clients who are really resistant to that, because they say, well, by giving my mother Narcan for me, you are assuming I'm going to overdose and use again, or you're condoning a recurrence. And that is absolutely not the case. I like to tell people it's like homeowners insurance. You never think your house is going to burn down from a fire. But that doesn't prevent you from getting a homeowner's insurance policy. You still get it, because catastrophic things can happen. Similarly, medications like Narcan really play an important role in the SUD treatment landscape, because it provides both patients and family members an insurance policy. And so I'd say that's probably the single most important thing with opioid use disorder. And when it comes to alcohol, as we kind of said in the beginning, and I think this is a good conclusion, moderation management is definitely not for everybody. If you have a very severe alcohol use disorder, odds are if you're going to struggle with being able to reduce intake. And so that's why it's so key to engage with your healthcare provider to discuss your individual situation. And here to where we're so happy and willing and excited to help folks in that journey.
I guess carrying on that thought, if there is an instance of moderation of the use of substances, I would imagine it's going to require ongoing evaluation and support How do you sort of control for that with the patients that you've had? And are the families or allies an important consideration with regards to providing that oversight as someone is using moderation management for their recovery journey?
Absolutely. It absolutely, a moderation management approach really requires active involvement, investment with both the providers and family members. Everybody being on the same page, making smart goals that are specific, measurable, attainable. And so being able to say, not just, I'm going to reduce alcohol intake, but I'm going to try to reduce it from X amount to X amount. And I'm going to try it in X period of time. And most importantly, if that doesn't succeed, here's what I'm going to do differently. And so it's so important to have continuation of care, both with your medical provider, but with families, with family therapists, so that everybody is on the same page of what those goals are. To be ultimately successful. And I will say there, from a medical perspective, there are even some labs that you can measure short term that will give you an objective reflection of, is this change helping my body? So I often, with folks who struggle with alcohol, I'll recommend that we get liver enzymes every 2 months, that we check cholesterol every 2 months. And what you'll see, both from an abstinent approach and a harm reduction approach, is that liver enzymes will often normalize. High cholesterol will often normalize, and even blood pressure can normalize just in a period as short as 8 weeks. And so that can be really powerful and really motivating for folks to see, wow, not only am I sleeping better because of my decreased intake, I'm not spending as much money, my relationships are better, but my body physically reflects in a pretty powerful way the positive changes that this has had.
Yeah, as we sort of wrap up here, I guess my question for you, and I think the listeners would appreciate it, is what does the client do next, a patient do next that's contemplating either abstinence or a moderation management path for their recovery? In particular, moderation management, is this being more of a newer approach to addiction treatment that may be a bit more controversial? And you have said that you favor abstinence as a first choice here. But for those that are pursuing moderation management, how do they get educated? How do they learn? What would they do in terms of next steps to see if this is an approach that would work for them?
2 next steps. Talk to your family and talk to your medical provider. And we would love that medical provider to be here, us at Aware. I will say, because moderation management is a newer approach, not all healthcare providers are really trained equally on it. And so if you're interested in moderation management, even if you don't see us at Aware Recovery Care, really talking to an addiction specialist about what that looks like is really key. And so I would say talking to your family, getting them involved early. Don't be discouraged if your family doesn't agree with your goals. In fact, I would say expect that. So talk with them. Don't be discouraged if folks disagree, and really seek out professional health, formal advice and treatment from an addiction specialist.
Lauren, thank you. I could go on, but I want to be cognizant to our listeners, and we're aiming for our podcast to be under 30 minutes, and we've done so in this case. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, the balance of your comments, and the thoughtfulness. It's been very interesting for me to hear. We are so blessed to have you at Aware Recovery Care that does operate a moderation management and harm reduction model here, and so it's important for listeners to hear from you. Thank you so much. Thanks again for listening to Wellaware Podcast. And until next time, stay well and enjoy the new year. Again, Happy New Year to everyone listening in. Take care.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.